Hey guys, welcome to our first official video where it feels like we're probably learning a little more about biology. We're going to be talking about things that we can see in today's world, not so much focusing on the past. So in our last unit, where we ended was on prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and we really didn't distinguish what that means. In this next unit, we're going to distinguish the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes and talk about the main component that makes up all of those types of cells, which is known as a cell. So as we go through this, I want you to learn that there are distinctions between the two types of cells and what makes a prokaryotic cell different from a eukaryotic cell. And there are a lot of defining features of each. In the lab in the next few weeks, we're going to go ahead and look at both of those types. Again, understand that in early life history, we started as prokaryotic cells, and then from there are extensions that have happened. Just a brief overview of the things that I want you to be able to accomplish at the end of this video and at the end of the notes and after we talk about all of this stuff in class. So you should be able to name the three parts of the cell theory and its importance to the identification of living things, identify the common features all cells have, compare and contrast prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and then finally identify the role of each cell structure. So believe it or not, science is ingrained in theories, and all of these thoughts that have gone through numerous amounts of testing in order to justify this explanation for something. So a long time ago, and when I say a long time ago, I mean like in the 1800s, there were several scientists that discovered different features of living organisms. And so collectively, as the years went on, those ideas were put together and formulated this theory known as the cell theory. And this unifies all living organisms. And what this theory is talking about is that cells are the building blocks of life, that every single living organism has to have cells, and those cells do something, and that those common functions are in all living organisms. There are three unifying thoughts, and everything we talk about for the rest of the year is going to be based on these three unifying thoughts. So we'll expand on all of these things, but if we really want to sum up the cell theory, these three things are a really nice way to sum it up. So all organisms are made of one or more cells, meaning they can be single-celled, sometimes called unicellular, or multicellular. When we start distinguishing between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, you're going to see what I mean by unicellular and multicellular. Second point of the cell theory, all life functions occur within cells. And when I'm talking about life functions, we use a really blanket term known as metabolism. And we talked about metabolism in class, and a lot of people are associating metabolism with eating, but it's not just that. When I'm talking about life functions or metabolism, I mean things like grow, reproduce, the ability to make energy. All of those things are part of metabolism. So again, I know that when we associate metabolism, we think of like weight, or we think of people that are able to eat a lot, but there's a lot more that comes to metabolism. It's any life process that happens, and all of those things happen on the cellular level within cells. Number three, all cells come from existing cells. When we talk about the reproduction of new cells or the making of new cells, we're talking about either mitosis or meiosis. And we're actually going to talk about both of those processes in the next few units, where we talk about how new cells are generated and why they're generated. We just talked about how all living organisms have cells. That's the basic summary of the cell theory. Now I want to focus on both types of cells, prokaryotic and eukaryotic, and how both of those cells have four common features that no matter what, if it's a cell, it has these four things. It's guaranteed every single time. Now remember that prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells are very much different, and we're going to talk about those differences here in a bit, but they do have some commonality. And when we talked about LUCA, when we were talking about early life formation, we know that LUCA was the organism that first contained the nucleic acid known as DNA. And then from there, we see changes over time that eventually led to us and all different types of organisms in the world. But the four features that are super important that really started the whole structure of cells are these four things: the plasma membrane, which is just a thin coat around the cell. So the plasma membrane is a part of the cell, but it's like the gateway that determines what comes in and out of the cell. So if I were drawing this circle here, sorry, my pen's, there you go. So the circle around, that's kind of like holding the inside and then has the outside area touching it, that is the plasma membrane. So has one area of the outside, and then it's containing all of this stuff on the inside. So the plasma membrane is the actual black circle surrounding it. And every single cell is just a little bit different depending on what the type of cell it is, depending on the organism as well. But every single cell has this thin coating. And again, this protects what's going to go inside and what comes out of the cell. If we didn't have this protective feature, there would be no way for a cell to actually do its processes in a protective manner. The second common feature that all cells have is a cytoplasm. Basically what this is everything contained inside of the plasma membrane. So this word inside, that is the cytoplasm. Everything inside of the plasma membrane is the cytoplasm. And the cytoplasm has multiple things in there depending on the type of cell. But again, all the material inside of that cell membrane is known as the cytoplasm. And then we can break it down from there. The third thing that all cells have in common are ribosomes, and this is where a structure where proteins are made. I told you a while back that proteins are super important to our bodies because they do everything. They are the workers of the body. They determine how often we're breaking down food. They determine us breathing. They determine our heart beating. They determine us moving. Everything in our bodies that we do is thanks to a particular type of protein. So it's really important that we have a good place for them to be made. And so the ribosomes are really important because that is the site of protein formation. And then finally, the fourth commonality between all types of cells is DNA. Every single cell has DNA. It's the genetic instruction to make proteins. Genetic instruction to make proteins. Again, proteins are super important because they do everything in our bodies. We need to have something tell our bodies, hey, this is what we're actually making. And that's what DNA is. So finally, hopefully this picture looks familiar and we're kind of talking about something that we've already been talking about. Every single unit we talk about in bio is going to build on top of each other. So in the last unit, again, we stopped at prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and we learned the very basics that prokaryotes are simple and eukaryotes are complex. We're going to learn what that actually means in this video. So before we go on, I just wanted to touch bases on diversity of cells and talk about the cell shape and size. What I want you to know about the cell size is that they have to be small. The reason they have to be small is it's much more efficient for a cell to be small than it is to be larger. More surface area means more waste. It also means that the cell has to work harder to provide nutrients to live. So if a cell is smaller, it's much more efficient at its job. If it's bigger, it is less efficient. Cell size indicates efficiency. The next point, as far as shape goes, all cells have a different shape based on their function. When we talk about multicellular organisms, such as humans, we're going to start talking about the different type of cells we see in our body. I talk a lot about that in HAP. So if you're interested in learning about different types of cells in the human body, that would be a great class. In this class, we're going to generally talk about it. But like I said, all cells have a different shape based on their function. So that means muscle cells are going to look a little different than our brain cells or what's called our nervous cells. So keep that in mind. And that's the same thing for all types of organisms, whether they're single-celled or multicellular. Now, when we talk about prokaryotic cells, we are talking about cells that do not have a nucleus. That's what defines a prokaryotic cell. No nucleus. And the reason why they don't have a nucleus is because they're very, very basic and simple organisms that are super efficient at surviving because they've survived for millions of years, but they don't need the nucleus. They're not so complex that they need to have such a protective feature. And the fact that they can reproduce so quickly doesn't mean they need to survive so much. So for single-celled organisms, for prokaryotic cells who are single-celled all the time, an example would be like bacteria. Bacteria can reproduce so quickly. It doesn't need 9 months of pregnancy like humans do, or 2 years like an elephant. It just needs 24 hours and then bacteria will flourish. You can go from being not sick to sick in 24 hours because bacteria is so good at reproducing. So in order to reproduce so quickly, they need to be very simple, very, very basic, and single-celled organisms are super good at this. So prokaryotic cells, again, they're very, very basic. You'll see that their DNA is just kind of floating in the cytoplasm wherever. But again, they don't need a protective feature like the nucleus because they can reproduce so quickly. So very small organisms are considered prokaryotes, and they have prokaryotic cells. So prokaryotes have prokaryotic cells. These guys are single-celled. They have no nucleus, very simple, very basic. In comparison to that, we have the eukaryotes, which contain eukaryotic cells. Now, eukaryotes are typically multicellular, but there are some single-celled organisms that are considered eukaryotes, where in one cell, they can do everything that I can do, like move, get their own food, reproduce energy. All of these things are done in one single cell. So it's actually kind of amazing that us as humans, these super complex organisms, do the same things as organisms that only have one cell. Pretty fantastic how life has been able to allow that to happen. But again, eukaryotic cells are more complex. And when I say multicellular, I mean that a human has billions of cells, trillions of cells, and all of these cells contain the exact same information, and they're different because of the functions that they have, but they still have the same exact information, and they have these other little tiny structures known as organelles. And so if you look at this picture, you'll see that this eukaryotic cell has different little features or little functions, little structures, like the endoplasmic reticulum, the nucleus, the Golgi apparatus. This is how eukaryotic cells have been able to diversify and be distinguishable in the animal kingdom, or not just the animal kingdom, but in the tree of life. We see all of these different organisms, but they've been able to diversify and become much more advanced because of these tiny little organelles that have formed over time. So cell structures of the eukaryotic cell, there are so much more within the eukaryotic cell. I have on this slide a picture of an animal cell. Plants and animal cells, they're both considered eukaryotic cells. However, they have a little bit of differences based on how they do things. So, for example, we know that plants use the sun to make energy for them, and that's how they survive. For us, we can't do that. So our cells are a little bit different than plant cells. And again, it's just based on the function. But I'm going to roughly go over some of these structures, and in class I will spend a lot more details. But the nucleus, it contains the DNA, a very protective feature. So the nucleus is kind of known as the control center of the cell. Mitochondria, this is where energy is made for the cell. The endoplasmic reticulum, we have two of them. One is known as the smooth, one is known as the rough. However, in class, we can just call it the ER. I'm not going to have you memorize these things or the picture, so I really don't think it's the end of the world if you call it the ER. Makes and transports proteins. The ribosomes, site of protein formation. We've already talked about the ribosomes. The Golgi apparatus is the processes and prepares proteins. So you'll see that our cells, their main job is something to do with proteins every single time. We got to get these made. We got to get them used. The cell knows that, and it does that job. The centrioles, which help in cell division. And again, in your notes, you'll see that I have two distinguishing types of eukaryotic cells, animal cells and plant cells. We are going to focus on those details as we start talking about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So we're not gonna like fully look at that until a couple of chapters. But if you have any questions, please make sure to ask me on Edpuzzle. I tried to go slower in this video, but I know that I'm not very good at that. Have a good one.